The fluorescent lights hummed their 2 a.m. song, that electric monotone that made time feel like it was pooling on the linoleum instead of passing. Mercy General's night shift ICU was quiet in the way that only hospitals got quiet, which wasn't quiet at all. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. Monitors beeped their steady surveillance. Somewhere down the corridor, an old man coughed in short, wet bursts that echoed off the tile. Natalie Hayes moved through room 341 like she was reading water, every motion precise, economical, the kind of efficiency that came from knowing exactly what a body needed before the body knew it needed it. She adjusted the pillow beneath a 73-year-old stroke patient's head, checked the angle of his neck to ensure the airway wouldn't collapse, and positioned his left arm so the fall line wouldn't kink. The other nurses, Marcus and Jennifer, had long stopped noticing how Natalie positioned her patients. They'd stopped noticing how she checked spinal alignment, how she accounted for pressure points that wouldn't declare themselves until 4 a.m., how she moved like someone who'd learned anatomy not from textbooks but from keeping people alive when textbooks couldn't help anymore. She was 38, with salt and pepper hair cut short enough that it never got in the way, and scars on her forearms that caught the fluorescent light when she reached for charts. The scars were thin, precise lines, some from shrapnel, some from field surgery tools that had been too hot and too close to skin. She never wore long sleeves, even in winter. If anyone asked, she said she'd been clumsy as a kid. Nobody asked anymore. At the nurse's station, Natalie pulled up the admission logs for room 347. The patient had come in at 18:47 hours, 5 hours ago, during the shift change handoff when the day crew was already thinking about their cars in the parking lot and the night crew was still pretending they didn't hear the call bell from 348. Male. Age 61. Disabled. Shrapnel wounds to thorax and lumbar spine. Daughter at bedside. Medical history noted service-related injuries, which was hospital code for don't ask about the specifics because he probably won't talk about them. She didn't look at the name on the chart yet. Some part of her already knew. When she finally looked, her hands went absolutely still on the keyboard. Her breath didn't change. Her jaw didn't clench. She looked at the name the way a soldier looked at an old uniform hanging in the closet, with recognition and distance and the precise compartmentalization that kept people functional in jobs that broke most people. Colonel Marcus Webb. Former. The man who'd commanded her son's platoon in Tikrit. The man who'd kept Ethan's photograph in his wallet through 2 tours, through the IED that took his leg below the knee, through the months at Bethesda Naval Hospital when doctors were still arguing about whether phantom limb pain was real or psychosomatic. The man who'd sent her a letter 3 years ago, sealed, handwritten, his signature looking like it had been written through a tremor, saying that Ethan was the finest young Marine he'd ever had the privilege to command and that he was sorry. Just sorry. No explanation. No apology that made sense. Just the word pressed into the paper. She closed the chart. Opened it again. Confirmed it. Marcus Webb was in room 347, 2 doors down the corridor. Natalie exhaled once and stood. She was a night shift nurse at Mercy General in Portland, Oregon. She was a woman in scrubs with a name badge clipped to her chest that said Ren Hayes, RN. She was someone who volunteered for every holiday rotation, who never called in sick, who'd been passed over for charge nurse 3 times because Dr. Sterling had told the hospital administrator that Natalie lacked the assertiveness necessary for leadership. What she was not, anymore, was Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. What she was not, anymore, was the combat medic who'd intubated patients in a field hospital in Anbar province while rounds were coming through the walls. What she was not, anymore, was the woman whose hands had stitched 17 people back together when there wasn't time for proper surgery, when there was only blood and field tourniquets and the understanding that you either worked fast or worked in a graveyard. She touched the pair of worn combat boots on her locker shelf, wrapped in plastic, preserved like some kind of shrine, before she walked toward room 347. The boots had come back from Tikrit in a duffel bag with 3 other pairs, all of them the same shade of desert tan worn lighter at the toes from 17 years of standing in operating rooms and trauma bays and field positions where you couldn't sit down because if you sat down you might not get back up. She'd wrapped them in plastic the day she'd taken the discharge paperwork and the pension she couldn't touch and the classified separation agreement that meant nobody at any government database could confirm that Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes had ever existed at all. She'd wrapped them and placed them on her locker shelf because you didn't throw away boots like that. Boots like that had carried you through things that broke people who weren't carrying boots like that. Now she walked toward room 347 in white K-Swiss sneakers that cost $67 and made no sound on the hospital linoleum. Marcus Webb's daughter was asleep in the visitor's chair, her head tilted back at an angle that was going to cost her a neck ache come morning. She was maybe 35, blonde, wearing a Stanford sweatshirt that had been slept in. There was a wedding ring on her left hand and a photograph on the bedside table, Marcus in dress blues, arm around the same woman, probably 15 years and a divorce ago. Marcus himself was awake. He was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone who'd exhausted the entertainment options and was now just counting tiles. He had the kind of frame that had once been muscular, the kind that carried the weight of command easily, and now carried the weight of phantom pain where his right leg ended 6 inches below the knee. Prosthetics were leaning against the wall beside the bed, good ones, military-grade titanium that probably cost more than a used car, which meant someone in his family had money or someone in the government still remembered that he'd sacrificed in a way that most people never would. "Evening, sir," Natalie said, keeping her voice in the register she perfected over 3 years, warm, professional, the kind of voice that conveyed efficiency without personality, care without connection. "I'm Natalie. I'm your night nurse. How's your pain level right now?" His head turned. His eyes, which had been fixed on the ceiling tiles like they held answers, refocused on her face. For 3 seconds, maybe less, maybe more, nothing happened. His eyes traced her face the way you might trace a map of somewhere you used to know. His breathing didn't change, which was remarkable, because it should have. His daughter shifted in the chair but didn't wake. "7," he said. His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used much recently. "Upper back. Lumbar. The usual." He didn't recognize her. Or he did and wasn't going to say it. Either way, Natalie had learned that some silences were doors and some silences were walls, and the only thing you could do was keep moving forward. "The doctor said we can adjust your pain management," she said. "But I want to try repositioning first. Sometimes the hospital beds put pressure on the wrong spots. If I adjust things, we might ease it without adding more medication to your system." "You're a good nurse," he said. "I do what I can, sir." She moved to the bed with a kind of precision that came from understanding human anatomy as a system of leverage and weight distribution and the specific angles that kept people from hurting worse than they already did. She worked the bed controller down so his head was lowered slightly, checking his spinal alignment the way a mechanic might check an engine. His daughter was still asleep. He was still watching her face. She kept her expression professional, unremarkable, the face of someone who'd done this 3,000 times and would do it 3,000 more. "This might feel weird," she said. She adjusted the angle of his lumbar support, using the pillow from the empty chair to create a small gap between his back and the mattress where the shrapnel pain was worst. She moved his left leg slightly, relieving pressure on the sciatic nerve that probably felt like fire running through tissue that wasn't even there anymore. She positioned his right arm, the good side, the side that still had all its original equipment, so the foreline wouldn't kink. Her hands moved the way hands moved when they'd done this work for more than a decade, steady as a surgical laser, precise enough that she never touched him more than necessary, never lingered, never gave anything away. "How's that?" she asked. "Better. Already?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then, you ever think about the choices that led you to a specific place? At a specific time?" She didn't answer. She was adjusting the blanket, checking the catheter line, keeping herself busy with the small mechanics of nursing. But her hands steadied themselves against the mattress rail. "I think about it sometimes," he continued. "I think about how one choice, one decision, just one moment where I went left instead of right, everything would be different. That kid in my platoon. Ethan. Smart as hell. Best map reader I ever had. One moment he stepped slightly to the right instead of left, and he's still got both legs and a normal life instead of, he stopped. His daughter shifted in the chair. Sorry. Pain makes me philosophical. No apology necessary, sir, Natalie said. She was looking at his chart, not his face. I'll be back in 20 minutes to check your vitals. Push the call button if anything changes. She was halfway out the door when Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway in front of her like a car that materialized in your blind spot just when you weren't looking for it. He was wearing his white coat over a shirt that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly car payment, and Italian leather shoes that squeaked slightly on the linoleum. He was 46, with the kind of tan that came from the country club in Beaverton, and the kind of smile that made patients feel like they should trust him because his face had already been pre-approved by someone important. Natalie, he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone discovering a stain on his carpet. What are you doing? Repositioning the patient for comfort, doctor. He's having lumbar pain from. Room 347 is a pre-op admit. He's scheduled for imaging at 0600. He doesn't need comfort adjustment. He needs sleep. She was still holding the door open. His daughter was still asleep. Marcus was very still on the bed, the way soldiers got still when they were trying not to react to something offensive. The positioning helps with pain management, Natalie said. It might help him sleep. What it does, Dr. Sterling said, and his voice went very soft, which was worse than when it was loud, is waste billable time on comfort measures when he's scheduled for imaging that's already costing the hospital $1,700. You're not his therapist, Natalie. You're a night shift nurse. Act like one. Behind him, Marcus's daughter woke up. Her eyes went wide. Her hand reached for her father's hand. Natalie's jaw was level. Her breathing was steady. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. When she spoke, her voice was the same temperature as the air conditioning. Yes, doctor, she said. She walked past him toward the medicine station, and she didn't look back at room 347, didn't acknowledge the daughter's tears or Marcus's silence or the moment where everything that had been buried started making noise beneath the surface. She was Natalie Hayes, night shift nurse. She had 8 more hours of shift. She had $200 in her checking account and a 12-year-old son at home who didn't know anything about who his mother used to be, and she had a very clear understanding that sometimes the smallest kindness cost the most. What she didn't know was that Dr. Sterling was already thinking about how to fix the problem of a nurse who cared too much about patients and not enough about margins. What she didn't know was that Marcus Webb had recognized her the moment she'd said his name wasn't on her file, had recognized the woman who'd pulled his second lieutenant out of a burning Humvee in Tikrit, who'd applied a tourniquet to his leg with hands that didn't shake because those hands had never learned how. What she didn't know was that the next day, before her shift even started, an old Marine in a hospital bed would make a phone call that would start a chain reaction moving through the Pentagon with the speed of something that had been waiting 17 years to move. And that was the last quiet shift Natalie Hayes would ever work at Mercy General. The break room at 0300 hours smelled like burnt coffee and the particular silence that comes when people stop pretending to like each other. Natalie sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a cold cup, watching 3 nurses grab their belongings in coordinated haste. They glanced at each other, just a flick of the eyes, a small nod, and then moved. No one looked at her. No one said goodnight. The door swung shut behind them with the kind of finality that sounds like a closing hatch on a submarine. She sat alone under fluorescent lights that buzzed with the constancy of a ventilator. 15 minutes. That was her break. She used it watching the steam rise from a coffee cup she wouldn't drink, understanding exactly what had happened in Dr. Sterling's patient room. The message wasn't complex. It was written in the language of institutional power, and she'd spent 12 years reading similar dialects in different languages, on different continents. You can be among us. Or you can stand alone. Not both. The next morning, Natalie arrived for her shift and found the notice on the public unit board where everyone would see it. The paper was printed on official hospital letterhead, the kind that carried weight because administrators made sure it did. Disciplinary notice. The font was bold enough that other staff stopped to read it. N. Hayes. Inefficient time management. Insubordination re. Patient care protocols. Further violations will result in termination. 2 orderlies stood reading it when she approached, and they peeled away like leaves in a current, their eyes fixed on the floor. She pulled the notice down. Protocol allowed employees to request removal if they believed it was unjust, but Sterling had anticipated that. 3 copies appeared within an hour. 1 on the board. 1 in her personnel file. 1 in the supervisor's office with a handwritten note from Sterling, "Keep this visible. Staff needs to understand standards." The message wasn't about the notice. It was about the escalation. First public humiliation. Then institutional documentation. Then isolation. Then termination. That evening, Sterling's office intercom buzzed. His voice was smooth, measured, professional, the voice of someone who had learned to weaponize courtesy. "Nurse Hayes, my office. Now." Not a request. It wasn't phrased as one, which meant it wasn't one. She set down her tablet and walked through the corridor where the afternoon light fell through tall windows in rectangles of gold. She could feel the weight of yesterday's conversations, the whispers that had probably already reached Sterling through channels she couldn't see or access. His office smelled like leather chairs and expensive cologne, the kind designed to announce that success had a scent. Sterling sat behind a mahogany desk with his fingers steepled, a pose he'd probably seen in some business magazine. Behind him, a framed diploma from Johns Hopkins. Beside it, a photo of him shaking hands with the hospital CEO. On his desk, a folder labeled Med Supply Solutions, vendor agreement with handwritten dollar amounts in the margins. Lots of zeros. Natalie's eyes caught the numbers before she could stop them, $847,000 in annual contracts. $3.2 million in 3-year projections. Her hands remained perfectly still. "Sit," Sterling said. She sat. The chair was designed to place her lower than his eye level, all psychology, no accident. "I want to talk about your performance trajectory. Or perhaps more accurately, your lack of one." She waited. Silence was a tool. "You're too emotionally invested in charity cases to maintain professional standards, Hayes. These veterans think they're special because they wore a uniform, but they're just another diagnosis code to insurance companies. Diagnosis codes don't pay our mortgage. They don't fund research wings. They don't keep this hospital operating." He leaned back in his leather chair, which creaked with the authority of expensive furniture. "You need to understand how hospitals actually work. How medicine actually works. It's not some noble calling, it's a business. You either understand that, or you understand the door." Natalie felt something shift in her chest, a physical sensation like a hatch opening. She could see the folder on his desk. She could read the numbers. She understood, in that moment, exactly what was happening at Mercy General. The billing codes that didn't match procedures. The phantom charges. The Med Supply Solutions vendor appearing on every veteran's account with prices that ran 300% over market rate. Sterling hadn't just been conducting cost analysis meetings. He'd been conducting auditions. Testing to see who would notice. Who would care? Who would stay silent? One measured breath. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from fear or sadness, but from the specific exhaustion of watching power corrupt in real time, watching a man weaponize his position against people who had already lost everything. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact. "I understand exactly how this hospital works, Doctor," she said. Her voice had dropped half an octave from yesterday. "I understand it very well." Sterling's expression darkened like a sky before a storm. His jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his skin. He smiled, but it was the smile of a predator recognizing that the prey had teeth. "We'll see how long you last here, Florence Nightingale," he said, using the nickname with the precision of a man who had studied her for weaknesses. "I suspect not much longer." She was dismissed. As she stood to leave, Sterling's hand moved toward his desk phone. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could hear his voice as she closed the door, low, controlled, already working the machinery that moved at speeds civilians couldn't match. I need you to start documenting everything on Hayes. Every minute away from a patient. Every resource used. Every conversation. I need it airtight. She's becoming a liability, and liabilities need to disappear before they contaminate the entire operation. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 nights later when Natalie sat at the nursing station processing discharge paperwork, a task Sterling had reassigned to her, a punishment dressed up as routine, and noticed something that made her breath catch. The first veteran's bill had charges for a Med-Supply Solutions wound vacuum pump that had never been used in his room. She'd been with him during the entire admission. She knew what equipment he'd needed. This wasn't on his chart. She cross-referenced his file to the supply logs. The pump had been ordered on day 2, charged at $8,400, and listed as utilized for negative pressure wound management. His wound was a 6-centimeter laceration on his left forearm. A basic laceration didn't need a wound vacuum. It needed sutures and daily dressing changes. She pulled up 2 more veteran patient charts, randomly selected, meant to give her an excuse if anyone asked what she was researching. Same pattern. Med-Supply Solutions appearing on accounts like a signature. Equipment never used. Procedures never performed. Prices that bore no relationship to actual market costs. The numbers climbed. The patterns held. The trail led back to Sterling's office, to those dollar amounts she'd seen in the folder margins, to a vendor agreement that had nothing to do with patient care and everything to do with someone's personal revenue stream. When she mentioned it quietly to her unit supervisor the next morning, whispering in the medication room where no one else could hear, the supervisor's face went the color of old gauze. "Drop it, Natalie," she said. Her voice trembled. "Please. You don't want Sterling's attention." But it was already too late for that. Her access to the billing system was revoked that afternoon. System maintenance, the IT department said in a bland email that nobody believed. Only her login was affected. Only hers. Sterling began appearing during her rounds like a shadow that had learned to move independently, watching her interactions with patients, timing her movements, creating a record of the seconds she spent on what he decided was non-billable comfort. He reassigned her best patients, the ones who required simple management, the ones who would write positive reviews, to other nurses. In their place came the difficult admissions. The patients with complex pain profiles and psychiatric histories, the ones who needed time, the ones who generated documentation errors under the kind of patient load that was designed to break people. Mercy General had 247 beds. Natalie was carrying the caseload of someone managing 31 patients on a unit that shouldn't exceed 20 per nurse. The math was deliberate. That night, the Marine veteran told her something that changed the weight in her chest from fear into something else entirely. She was adjusting his bed angle, the kind of small comfort that Sterling had declared non-billable, and he looked at her with eyes that had seen things, eyes that recognized other people who had seen things. "You ever served?" he asked. Not because he suspected. Because he knew. "A long time ago," she said. "Tikrit." She didn't answer. "My lieutenant was a good man. 2nd Platoon, 3rd Battalion. There was a medic, a woman, who pulled him out of a building after an IED strike. Got 3 rounds in her own shoulder doing it but didn't stop moving until he was safe. That lieutenant didn't make it home, but he talked about that medic for the rest of his life. He kept a photo." The Marine reached beneath his blanket with his right hand, his good hand, and pulled out a worn wallet. The photo inside showed a young man in dress uniform. Her son. Her boy. The one who had died 2 years ago in a training accident the Pentagon had classified. Natalie's hand shook as she returned the photo. Not trembling hands. Shaking like a seismograph registering an earthquake in the deep places where she'd buried everything. "You look like her," the Marine said quietly. "Around the eyes. You have that same look." Like you've already survived the worst and you're just deciding whether it's worth surviving the rest. That night, Natalie came home to her small house in Portland and opened the showbox she'd forbidden her 12-year-old son to ever touch. Inside, folded carefully in acid-free paper, were the decoration she'd earned 17 years ago. A Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. A purple heart with the year Tikrit embossed on the ribbon. Beneath them, a letter on Pentagon stationery with a classification stamp so high it required top-secret clearance just to read the sentence that ordered her to never, ever speak about her service again. Your service record has been classified. You are ordered to maintain civilian cover. Any attempt to surface will result in prosecution. You do not exist. She closed the box and slid it back beneath the floorboards where it had been waiting for someone to finally understand that it was time. The next morning, Sterling met with 2 men in suits in the hospital conference room while Natalie reviewed charts at the nursing station outside. Through the glass walls, she could see them spreading her personnel file across the table like prosecutors building a case. The CEO was there, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Sterling was talking, his hands moving in the measured gestures of a man explaining how to eliminate a problem. But he didn't know that the Marine veteran had already made a phone call from his hospital bed. He didn't know that a message was moving through channels that existed before Sterling was born, networks that existed in a classified space where phone calls traveled at the speed of national security. The discharge paperwork was mundane: insurance codes, provider signatures, standard release forms. But Natalie's eyes caught what others missed. MedSupply Solutions appeared 3 times on the Marine veteran's bill: $847 for orthopedic positioning aids, $1,200 for specialty compression bandages, $560 for advanced pain management apparatus. She'd been in his room 14 hours across 2 shifts. She'd seen exactly 1 positioning pillow, standard hospital issue, and no specialty compression supplies at all. The veteran was using standard gauze and over-the-counter pain patches. She pulled his chart from 3 months prior. Another discharge. Same vendor. $923 charged. She'd worked that unit rotation. She remembered his care. The supplies weren't there. Natalie sat at the break room table at 2,300 hours with her phone open to the patient billing portal. The screen cast her face in pale blue light. The fluorescent fixtures hummed overhead like insects in a trap. She started cross-referencing. The Marine's current admission showed charges for certified pain management consultant visits, 3 of them, billed at $400 each. She'd been his primary nurse. There had been no consultant. She documented every interaction. No record of anyone entering his room except staff. The pattern wasn't random. It was systematic. Every veteran patient admitted to the night shift under Dr. Sterling's oversight carried phantom charges. Charging for services rendered. Billing for supplies never delivered. It was as precise as a surgical incision, and it worked because most patients didn't scrutinize the paperwork. Insurance paid. The hospital kept its cut. MedSupply Solutions was registered to a P.O. box in Eugene, Oregon. She looked up from her phone. The break room was empty except for the vending machine's low electrical whine. The next morning, she arrived for her shift to find Dr. Sterling's office door open. A woman in a tailored charcoal suit sat across from him, her posture angled like a shark's fin. Medical supply vendor. Natalie recognized the look, the careful distance of people negotiating percentages. The suit woman slid a manila folder across his desk. Sterling opened it without looking up, smiled, and extended his hand. The handshake lasted exactly 3 seconds. Natalie turned and walked toward the supply room. She kept her face level. Her breathing steady. What she'd seen lasted long enough to catalog. The woman's company badge clipped to her jacket read MedSupply Solutions Regional Director. The folder had been thick. Negotiations like that didn't happen in hospital offices for legitimate business. Natalie had served in the military long enough to recognize the architecture of corruption. It always looked like 2 people agreeing to something that needed no words. The following afternoon, a hospital-wide message arrived via email. All staff. Mandatory meeting. Conference room B, 1,400 hours. Natalie read it once, then read it again. The email header was from the CEO directly. The subject line, New Hospital Efficiency Protocols, all clinical staff required. She knew what was coming before she walked into the conference room. The CEO stood at a podium beside Dr. Sterling, her expression carefully neutral. Behind them, the hospital board members, 5 of them, sat in chairs arranged like a tribunal. Sterling stepped forward with the fluid confidence of a man who'd just been handed institutional power. He was holding a folder. Natalie noticed his fingers were steady. He was smiling. Effective immediately, Sterling began, his voice carrying the tone of someone reading a script he'd written. We're implementing a comprehensive financial efficiency initiative. The hospital's bottom line has been impacted by unsustainable patient care practices. Excess time spent on non-billable interactions. Unnecessary diagnostic procedures. Compassion-driven care that costs more than it generates. He paused. His eyes moved across the room. When they landed on Natalie, he held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Charity cases will require pre-authorization from my office before any non-essential interventions. The phrase of non-essential interventions hung in the air like contamination. All overtime requires advance approval. All diagnostic requests will be evaluated for cost-effectiveness. Staff members who continue operating under outdated patient-first protocols will face disciplinary review. He closed the folder. This is about sustainability. This is about survival. The hospital that survives is the hospital that understands the difference between medicine and business. The board members nodded in unison. That evening, at 2,145 hours, the Marine veteran pressed his call button. Pain in his lower back was escalating, the shrapnel damage from his combat injury, the nerve damage that made sleep impossible. Natalie arrived with her medication cart, but when she went to pull an X-ray order for the radiologist, the system showed a flag, cost containment hold. Request authorization from Dr. Sterling. She picked up the phone and called Sterling's personal line. He answered on the second ring, and before she could speak, he said, I already know. Chronic pain patient. Probably drug-seeking. Chart shows PTSD diagnosis. These guys always want more narcotics. Tell him we're implementing strict protocols. Ibuprofen and rest. No imaging. Natalie's jaw tightened. She said nothing. She hung up. The veteran's color was off when she returned to his room, pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool room temperature. His breathing was audible, moving air with visible effort. She checked his oxygen saturation, 94%. Normal range. But his ribs were expanding too much, like he was working harder than he should. She placed her hand on his chest and felt his heart rate, rapid, borderline tachycardic. His trachea looked slightly deviated. The doctor won't approve imaging, she told him, keeping her voice level. But I'm documenting everything. Your vital signs. Your respiratory effort. Everything. The veteran nodded. He'd been military. He understood that sometimes documentation was all you could do. She pulled her personal phone from her pocket and opened the voice recording app. She positioned the phone in the pocket of her scrubs with the microphone facing outward. Then she turned back to her charting station and wrote everything she was seeing in clinical language that no one could dispute. Increased work of breathing. Tracheal deviation noted upon visual inspection. Tachycardia. Patient reports increased pain. Imaging request submitted and denied due to cost containment protocol. The timestamp was precise, 1,430 hours. At 0200 hours, the monitor alarms woke half the unit. Room 347. The veteran was gasping, his face turning the color of old bruises, his lips darkening from pink to purple. The monitor showed his heart rate climbing, 118, 125, 132 beats per minute. Oxygen saturation falling, 90, 88, 86%. Natalie was already moving before her conscious mind caught up to what her eyes were seeing. She ran the monitor strip. Classic tension pneumothorax, the patient's own lung had ruptured, air leaking into his chest cavity, collapsing his lung, compressing his heart. Every breath made it worse. He had minutes. The daughter was screaming from the hallway. Help him! Why isn't anyone helping him? Natalie was at his side, hand steady as a surgical laser. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, the only tool that could save him now. 2 intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She didn't think about protocols. She didn't think about Sterling's restrictions. She thought about the Marines under her command in Tikrit, the ones who'd survived because she'd acted without hesitation when hesitation meant death. She swabbed his chest with antiseptic. Found the landmark. Inserted the needle between his ribs. The hiss came immediately, air escaping, pressure releasing, the sound of a man's life being saved in one visceral moment. His color improved in seconds. Pink returning to his lips. His breathing easing. His oxygen saturation climbing, 88, 91, 94, 96%. Trachea shifting back to center. 40 seconds total. The veteran's daughter collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing with relief. Natalie pulled the needle out and taped the site, her movements precise, efficient, muscle memory taking over from her years of field medicine. The room was already full, a crash team appeared, the on-call physician arrived from surgery, the monitor normalized into a steady rhythm. Then the doors burst open. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway, his phone already in his hand. 2 hospital board members flanked him like bodyguards. His face was flushed, but his voice was ice. She performed an invasive procedure without authorization. That's grounds for immediate termination. That's a violation of hospital protocol. That's license review. The room went silent. Natalie looked at Sterling. Her hands were still gloved in latex. The needle was in the sharps container. The veteran was breathing. His daughter's tears had stopped. The board members were staring at her like she'd committed treason. Sterling stepped closer. Escort her out. Now. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when one of the board members looked at the veteran, looked at his stable vital signs, looked at the evidence that he'd been dying and was now alive, and then looked back at Sterling's face and saw absolute confidence. Absolute certainty. Absolute faith that institutional power would protect him. The board member nodded. The veteran's lips turned blue at 03 for 7 hours. Natalie was charting at the nurse's station when the alarm triggered, not the gentle escalation of a monitor alert, but the sharp spike of a man gasping for air. She moved before the second beep sounded, her feet already crossing the threshold while the monitor screamed. The veteran's eyes were wide, panic-filled, searching for oxygen that wouldn't come. His chest heaved. His trachea had shifted visibly to the right side of his neck, the cartilage rings pressing outward like a boxer's distended cheek. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung pressing against the other. Compressing his heart. Killing him in real time. The on-call physician was in the ICU 3 floors down with a post-op bleed. He'd told Natalie 15 minutes ago that he'd call back before making rounds. It wasn't a request. It was a courtesy. He was 20 minutes away at minimum. The veteran had 40 seconds. Natalie moved like muscle memory had a voice of its own. Her hands found the crash cart, not the defibrillator cart, not the code blue kit. She needed a needle. 14-gauge angiocath. The plastic felt familiar against her palm, like an old weapon returned to a familiar grip. She didn't call for backup. She didn't announce what she was doing. The veteran's daughter was asleep in the chair beside his bed. Natalie didn't wake her. Palpate the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Find the landmarks. Her fingers pressed the space between his ribs like a locksmith finding the tumbler. The skin was cool, slick with sweat. She'd cleaned this with betadine before the veteran's eyes fully comprehended what was happening. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. His lungs weren't inflating. The needle went in. No resistance. That's what told her everything was wrong inside him. The needle should have caught tissue, should have met the lung with some friction. Instead, it slid like a finger into water, and the moment the catheter cleared the pleural space, the hiss of air escaping sounded like a radiator releasing 18 months of pressure. Oxygen saturation, 72%. Then 78. Then 85. The veteran's body sagged against the pillows. His eyes closed. His breathing deepened, slowed, stopped being an emergency. Became a rhythm again. She left the catheter in place and stepped back, her hands already steady again, her heart rate exactly where it should be. The heart monitor transitioned from chaos to a clean, steady beep. Sinus rhythm. The way God intended. 39 seconds. Close enough. The veteran's daughter jolted awake. What happened? Is he? He's stable, Natalie said. Tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression. Physician is being called. She didn't mention that the procedure belonged to emergency departments and trauma surgeons, not to night shift nurses working without explicit orders. She didn't mention the regulation she'd just violated or the licensing board review it could trigger. She mentioned none of that because the veteran was breathing and his daughter was crying with relief, and in the mathematics of medicine, those facts outweighed every policy manual Sterling had ever read. Dr. Sterling arrived at 0410 hours. 10 minutes late. 2 board members flanked him like bodyguards, the hospital quality director and a physician advisor from corporate, both men with the uncomfortable posture of people who'd been woken with a phone call they didn't want to take. Sterling's eyes found the catheter in the veteran's chest first. Then Natalie. His expression cycled through surprise, then something that looked like satisfaction, like he'd been waiting for her to break, and now she finally had. You performed an invasive procedure, Sterling said. Not a question. A pronouncement. The patient required immediate decompression, Natalie said. Her voice was level, measured. Lung collapse. Cardiac compression. Insufficient time to wait for physician evaluation. You're not a physician. You don't make those calls. Sterling turned to the board members. This is exactly the cowboy behavior I've been documenting. Nurses overstepping credentials, making clinical decisions beyond their scope. He produced a folder, thick, professional, meticulously tabbed. Incident reports with dates and times stamped in the margins. Observations about her pattern of insubordination. Written complaints from staff she'd allegedly offended. The papers looked official the way falsified documents always do when someone has spent hours building the architecture of a lie. She saved his life, the physician advisor said quietly, but his tone held a question mark. The issue is protocol violation, not outcome, Sterling replied. His voice had a teacher's patience, like he was explaining something simple to a slow student. We can't have nurses practicing medicine. It creates liability. It undermines physician authority. It opens the hospital to lawsuits from families who. The family's right here, the veteran said from the bed. His voice was rough, like gravel in a coffee can, but it was clear. She saved me. That's all that matters. Sterling smiled. Cold. Sir, your gratitude is understandable, but the hospital has protocols for a reason. By 0600 hours, the CEO arrived with an outside investigator from the state medical board, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard who'd been pulled from her bed at Sterling's insistence. Sterling had made the call himself, activating favors from a covered-up malpractice case 5 years prior where he'd helped bury evidence of a surgical error that killed a 42-year-old woman. The CEO owed him. The state investigator owed the CEO. These were the kinds of debts that moved mountains. The investigator requested Natalie's employment history. She provided her nursing license, current and clean. 3 years at Mercy General with spotless evaluations, though Natalie noticed Sterling's documentation conveniently excluded the word spotless. But when they asked for prior employers, prior credentials, prior background beyond the 3 years she'd worked in Portland, her records terminated. No listed employer. No verifiable work history. No references that anyone could contact. Sterling made the call himself, his finger pointing at her application from the hiring file. The number was military. His voice shifted into something almost honeyed when someone answered. Yes, hello, I'm calling to verify employment for a Natalie Hayes, claimed to have been employed in your department from 2013 through 2019. Can you confirm? He waited. His smile widened. No record found? Thank you. Very helpful. He hung up. So we have a nurse with a fabricated background performing unauthorized invasive procedures. The investigator's expression changed. Not skeptical anymore. Professional. The kind of face someone makes when they're documenting evidence of fraud. Security, Sterling said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The words had the weight of institutional authority behind them, and the two security officers who'd been standing in the hallway stepped forward with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this dozens of times. One of them was Marcus Webb, the IT director, and for just a moment, one beat, one breath, his eyes met Natalie's. Something passed between them. A calculation. A moment of understanding. Then his gaze shifted away. They escorted her from the unit while Sterling watched from his office window, his face framed by the glass like a painting of a man with everything he wanted. Her badge was deactivated at the front desk by a records clerk who wouldn't meet her eyes. Her locker was cleaned by HR, a supervisor placed her personal items into a cardboard box with the efficiency of someone removing a name from an organizational chart. The veteran saw her being walked out. He struggled to sit up despite the 4 lines and the monitors and his daughter's hands pressing him back down, and he called her name. Natalie didn't turn. If she'd turned, he would have seen what she was doing, maintaining operational composure, the same mask she'd worn in Tikrit when her team was pinned, the same expression she'd held when the classified operation had gone sideways and the Pentagon had decided she needed to disappear. She drove home at 1,415 hours. The Portland rain fell in sheets, the kind that hammers windshields and drowns thought. She parked in her driveway and sat in the driver's seat for 7 minutes without moving. The steering wheel felt like the only solid thing in a world that had just inverted itself. At the kitchen table, still wearing her scrubs, she found herself holding the veteran's combat boots. Worn leather, the sole separating slightly from the heel, scuff marks that decades hadn't removed. He'd asked her to polish them for his daughter's wedding. Said they were lucky boots. Said they'd walk through 3 countries and come home. She'd promised to shine them. That's where her 12-year-old son found her at 1,530 hours, her shoulders shaking silently, tears running like the rain outside, her hands clutching a dead Marine's boots like they were the last thing keeping her anchored to the earth. Mom. His voice was small. Why are you home? What happened? She opened her mouth. No words came. How do you explain to your child that you'd done the right thing and been destroyed for it? How do you explain that the government you'd served, the oath you'd kept through 17 lives and 3 tours and 2 Purple Hearts, had abandoned you the moment you couldn't hide anymore? He stood there, confused and frightened, waiting for his mother to explain a world that had suddenly made no sense. She couldn't. He went to his room. Closed the door quietly, the way he did when he was scared. Natalie sat alone at the kitchen table, still wearing her scrubs, still holding the boots, rain hammering the windows like the world was trying to break through. And then, in a house 3 blocks away, in a hospital 8 miles down the interstate, in government offices that Natalie's employment records didn't officially reach, a Marine veteran who'd commanded her son's platoon made a phone call. Just one. But it was the kind of phone call that doesn't require explanation, that activates systems that have been waiting for 15 years to be used. The kind of phone call that changes everything. She came home 2 hours early with her badge still in her pocket and her scrubs still wet from the rain outside. The kitchen was empty except for her son sitting at the table with his homework spread out like he'd been waiting for her, and when he looked up and saw her face, not the composed face she wore at Mercy General, but the real one, the broken one, he understood that something had fundamentally shattered. Natalie set the Marine veteran's combat boots on the counter, the ones he'd asked her to polish for his daughter's wedding, and she sat down across from her 12-year-old without removing her jacket. The tears came in silence, the kind that don't announce themselves, just spill and keep spilling while a child watches his mother collapse in slow motion. He asked if she was okay. She couldn't answer. He asked if someone had hurt her. Still nothing. The kitchen smelled like the antiseptic from her scrubs mixing with the remnants of his cereal bowl, and that ordinary detail made everything worse. This was supposed to be home, supposed to be the place where the world's cruelty didn't follow. Through her tears, she tried to explain why she'd been fired, but the words wouldn't form properly. How do you tell a child that saving someone's life cost you everything? How do you explain that the government you served for 12 years, the one that trained you to make split-second decisions that kept soldiers alive in Tikrit, had officially erased you from existence and then abandoned you to this humiliation the moment your competence threatened a man's profit margins? The Marine veteran had survived because of her steady hands and her muscle memory and her refusal to let protocols matter more than a human being's oxygen saturation. Dr. Sterling had fired her for it. That was the math that wouldn't balance. That was the equation that broke something in her chest that she thought had already been broken in a dozen ways by the Pentagon itself. Her son didn't understand. He sat there with his pencil still in his hand, his geometry homework forgotten, and the confusion in his eyes, the innocent question of why the adults weren't making sense, cut deeper than any of Sterling's cruelty ever could. Because Sterling was a coward hiding behind institutional power. But her son was just a kid trying to understand why his mother had come home destroyed because she'd been too good at her job. The silence between them felt like the silence before a siren, before the world changes. She finally reached across the table and held his hand, still wearing the latex glove she'd forgotten to remove, and promised him that it would be okay. Neither of them believed it. The next morning came too early and too bright. Her son, her older son, not the young one she'd held in the kitchen, but the teenager who'd been in his room when she'd gotten home, the one who'd gone through her closet at 0300 hours and found the showbox she'd told him never to open, walked into the hospital administrator's packed conference room at 0830 hours carrying that box like it weighed more than gravity. The room was full of people in suits, and Dr. Sterling was already mid-presentation at a podium, talking about upgraded billing software and cost recovery from nursing inefficiencies, his voice smooth as new money, his hands making those precise gestures that looked authoritative but meant nothing. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above, the same song they'd hummed when Natalie was escorted out by security 36 hours earlier. Her son walked to the center of the room. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't apologize for interrupting. He just planted his feet and said in a voice that cracked slightly with the weight of what he was about to do, "My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, and they need to see these." The room went dead silent. That was the moment the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their breath. He opened the showbox and spread her medals across the conference table like he was revealing the pieces of a broken god. The Navy Cross first, the highest award for valor, reserved for the kind of bravery that normal human calculations can't measure. Then 2 silver stars, each one representing a moment when she'd chosen to move toward danger instead of away from it. 2 purple hearts for wounds that had healed on the outside but never stopped bleeding in the dark hours when she was trying to sleep. The administrator, a woman named Patricia Corrin who'd been so eager to suspend Natalie without investigation, reached for the Navy Cross with trembling hands. Her fingers didn't quite touch it. She read the citation aloud, her voice breaking at conspicuous gallantry under enemy fire in Tikrit, and the room held together by sheer force of shock. Sterling had gone white. Not red with anger, not flushed with embarrassment, white, the color of a man watching his own professional death walk toward him in slow motion. The door opened before anyone could move. A Navy SEAL captain walked in, call sign Breaker, according to the name tape on his dress blues, and behind him came the Marine veteran, moving on new prosthetics that Natalie's own medical attention had likely made possible. The veteran had made one call from his hospital bed to his former commanding officer at the Pentagon, and that call had activated systems that had been waiting 15 years to be used. The captain's voice was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing any of us could imagine, the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its pitch. He named every decoration, every classified mission, every life Natalie had saved under fire. 17 confirmed saves. 17 families who still had mothers, fathers, sons, daughters because Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes had been willing to bleed for them. Then the FBI agents stepped forward. 2 of them, moving with that specific gravity that federal investigators carry. They announced they'd been investigating Medicare fraud at Mercy General for 8 months of watching and documenting while Sterling deleted billing records and falsified patient charts and took kickbacks from a company called MedSupply Solutions. 8 months of building a case that would end careers. The IT director, Marcus Webb, a Desert Storm veteran whose hands moved across keyboard like they moved across a rifle, with muscle memory and prayer, had saved every frame of security footage showing Sterling at his computer, deleting files at 2,200 hours on the night Natalie was fired. He'd reported it the next morning. The FBI had been watching for months before that, patient as snakes, waiting for the moment when the evidence would become undeniable. Sterling had handed them that moment when he'd tried to destroy a decorated officer's career to cover his own crimes. The administrator's hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold the medals anymore. They clattered against the conference table like shell casings. Sterling's attorney, a woman whose face was doing a very particular kind of professional distance, was already understanding that her client had just become a liability with a bar number. The state medical board representative who Sterling had weaponized against Natalie was staring at him like she was seeing him for the first time, and what she saw was a man who'd manipulated her into participating in his assault on a war hero. But that wasn't the worst part for Sterling. The worst part was the veteran. The worst part was watching the man whose trust he'd violated look at him with the kind of pity that soldiers reserve for those who've proven they'll never understand the meaning of service. The worst part was realizing that he'd picked a fight with someone whose entire network was built on the bedrock of honor, and he'd built his on sand and spreadsheets. The room was the kind of quiet you feel in your bones. The kind of silence that happens when systems finally stop protecting the guilty and start protecting the rest of us. 2 FBI agents moved toward Sterling with the kind of fluid precision that meant they'd done this before, and he had no more choices left. The medical boards would review him. The state would file charges. His license would be suspended pending criminal investigation. By noon, he'd be escorted from the building by the same security officers who'd removed Natalie, his office packed into boxes, his credentials revoked. By evening, the local news would catch him leaving, and a reporter would ask about the decorated Navy veteran he'd fired for saving a patient's life, and he'd have no answer except the sound of a man realizing he'd lost everything by trying to keep something he never deserved to have. And on the other side of Portland, in a hospital room where the morning light was starting to paint the walls gold, a disabled Marine veteran lay with his hands pressed together like a prayer, and he smiled, not the smile of someone who'd gotten revenge, but the smile of someone who'd watched the right person finally get recognized for what she'd always been. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power who didn't know your history, if you've ever seen corruption get exposed because someone refused to stay silent, please like this video and subscribe. Comment below, have you ever known someone whose quiet competence shamed the people around them? Let's build a community that recognizes heroes, especially the ones wearing scrubs instead of dress uniforms. Thank you for watching.